a lot of times there's sort of an assumption that just because you work with money, like you have all the resources at your disposal. And obviously protecting and, accounts, protecting data is like so important. But it's also like there's limited resources.
The Digital Banking Podcast is powered by Typhon. Typhon is the creator of Infinia, a dramatically better digital banking platform for community financial institutions, as well as several platform-agnostic, revenue-generating point solutions. Our highly configurable platform and broad ecosystem of third-party partners ensure our entire suite is scalable and extensible to meet the needs of any FI. On our podcast, you will hear host Josh DeTar discuss today's most pressing financial technology topics with seasoned industry experts from every possible discipline.
You know, your podcast hasn't officially made it until there's ads in it. But this is one you're not going to want to skip past. And, well, if you do, feel free to hit that fast forward 15 seconds button twice. Ever wonder what gives me my energy and enthusiasm during these podcasts? You know, outside of my relentless desire to learn about, connect, share, and build up community FIs and their mission to support the communities they serve? It's coffee, and lots of it. Now, you want to know what's better than your regular old coffee? How about donating $5 to the Children's Miracle Network hospitals through credit unions for kids every time you purchase high-quality, ethically sourced coffee that also provides living wages to coffee farmers? So if you want to listen to this episode with epic levels of caffeine-induced focus and help kids in need, head to javaforkids.org to learn more and buy a bag or 10. Thanks. Welcome to another episode of the Digital Banking Podcast. My guest today is Sanjib Kalita, the head of industry for Fintech Meetup. Sanjib really had me laughing when we started preparing for this podcast. He said even though he's been in the events business for over a decade, he's really 50-50. 50% extrovert and 50% introvert. You'll see why that's so funny throughout today's episode for sure. Now, if you're not familiar with Sanjib's history in the event space, here's the cliff notes. Ever heard of this little conference in Las Vegas called Money 2020? If you're listening to this podcast, I would put a lot of money on a bet that you have. Well, Sanjib was a part of the team that brought that event to life. His interest in the fintech space didn't start there, though. He started his professional life as a technologist, working as a chip designer at Intel. Sanjib describes himself as a builder in many ways. Technology is a cool tool that can shape a reality. You control output through input in software. And he quickly realized that he loved building in tech, but he also loved building in business, where the opportunity to impact people for the positive is present. He wanted to combine his tech acumen and hunger for the impact side of business, so he joined Citibank. What he thought would be a short stint turned into an incredibly formative, better part of a decade of his life. With a genuine passion for building and creating, he left Citi to be a part of a payments company that ultimately exited to Google and became the technology that current Google Wallet sits on. Seeing the impact technology and finance could have on the world, Sanjib then set out with Anil Agarwal and a small group of others to radically transform the face of fintech collaboration. While today's episode is not about Money 2020, the lessons learned and the impacts it has had on Sanjib and this industry are profound and not to be missed. People thought he was crazy to leave Google and the most exciting division of Google at that time, payments. Today, we get to talk a little bit about why, what was so important that he felt he could do in this industry, and the global impacts the fintech industry has. Having been born in India and lived all over the US and internationally, Sanjib has an acute attention to looking for unique ideas and perspectives through culture and people. We're going to see a lot of the 50% side of Sanjib that is the extrovert side today. But that other 50% just likes to be home, cooking with his wife, or out hiking in nature and trying new things, continuing his never-ending quest for expansion of life and experiences. With all of that distilled down into cliff notes, I don't know, I think there's something wrong with you if you're not excited to listen in on this podcast. So Sanjib, thank you so much for being a guest with me today.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you for the wonderful intro.
Yeah, well, so, man, as we were kind of prepping for this episode, I really was thinking, I was like, man, where do I start? There's like 6 million opportunities of things that I can't wait to pick your brain on. Um, but I really would like to start with just kind of the big elephant in the room that is Money 2020, right? I mean, arguably, this is one of the biggest, most notable events in our industry. And I'd really love to understand kind of this evolution for you through life and why you felt at the time it was so important to create something. I don't know if you ever expected it to become the magnitude of what it became, but why it was so important for fintech to have this level of collaboration. And I think, really love to pick your brain more so on the fintech collaboration side of that and why that was so important and how, Money 2020 kind of became secondary to that. So I'd love to kind of start there.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I guess like let me start off with like actually something that like a little bit of a joke that Anil and I used to say back in the early days. It was like, if you were in a cocktail party and it used to be if you wanted people to run away from you, you told people that I work in payments, and people would run away from you. But then around 2010, 2011, 12, like, if you said you worked in payments, then actually people started to come in and they wanted to listen more about what you're doing. So, I was at Citibank for, about a decade, as you said. And, it was like, it was um, it was like focused on bankers, maybe some payment networks. It was like sort of, I'd say within a certain set of an ecosystem. And then right before Money 2020 was launching, you had Google with Google Wallet, then you had the telecoms that were trying to launch their own mobile payments service. Then you had retailers that were trying to launch their payment service. Then you had other big tech companies, like places like Meta or Facebook back then, or even like Amazon. Like you had all these new participants getting into the ecosystem, being interested in this payments and financial services. And what we sort of found was that, like, if you went to any of the other existing events at the time, their definition of innovation was very was sort of limited to what they were doing. So for example, you take a credit card, rotate it 90 degrees. That's huge innovation. Um, and in reality, it was back then, but you could do so much more. And I think we sort of felt that let's create something where we talked about what you could do. Let's create something where we brought that new ecosystem, the broader ecosystem together. And I think like we could get into this more too, but like, as the years progressed, there was a bit of a maturation, the evolution, as well that I saw. But like in the beginning, it was like, let's get a bunch of people together who were interested in what was where the world was heading.
Um, you know, I think for folks who've listened to our podcast for years, probably have heard this many times, but I think one of the reasons why I was so excited to have this opportunity to talk with you too is, this is kind of the genesis of this podcast, right? Was it really started through the COVID pandemic where I lost the opportunity to go to these conferences and to have those in-person conversations with people. And I just felt like that collaboration connection was broken for me.
Yeah,
And so this became a way to kind of fill that void.
yeah,
And so it's really interesting kind of hearing you talk about, that being some of the genesis behind putting together an event where it was, no, we want to put people in a space where they're free to talk about innovation and collaborate around that, where there's kind of no barriers to it, right? Like,
yeah.
is that fair to say?
That's fair to say. And actually, I think you hit upon a very important point. Is that in a lot of cases, working in a regulated industry, if you talk about something that's really different, like you will get swatted down, and in your normal everyday office, back when everybody went into the offices, and but what we had, what we'd created was a safe space to talk about things that that were quite radical, and at the same time, it was like very it was real. It wasn't like so far in the future that we were talking about like automatons that were doing crazy things back in 2012.
I think that's why this is such a fascinating topic to me is I think just disruption as a whole is really fascinating to me. You see every industry goes through their own form of, ebbs and flows of disruption. And it's too easy to pick on the low hanging fruit of using the example of like, you know, uh, Blockbuster and Netflix, right?
Yeah,
But, but it is a really great example that's just very black and white. It's really easy to see. Like it was an industry that really just didn't see it coming.
hmm,
And it was because they weren't willing to take their blinders off and say, you know, oh, disruption in our industry is going from VHS to DVD. No, no,
yeah,
no. Disruption is completely changing the supply chain model for
yeah,
how your goods and services are distributed. And I think that's a really applicable thing to our industry of saying, like, like you're saying, like, if we think that disruption is turning the credit card 90 degrees, that's kind of like Blockbuster saying, well, disruption will just be we have a different form of what we distribute in our store,
yeah,
right? Versus, no, there's not going to be a store at all.
yeah, yeah.
um, and so I think, what's really fascinating in our industry is that, people have heard me preach about this probably far too many times already, but I think our industry is one where there is a very important element to the physical branches. So I'm not going down that path of just
Mm,
talking about disruption in that sense, but I think just talking about the space to talk about, well, what does real disruption look like in our industry?
mm,
What's not the, little tit for tat things that are going to change places here and there? Like, what are the leapfrog moments that are going to
mm,
happen? What are
mm,
the things that are going to have like widespread, catastrophically positive or negative impacts to our industry and the way that we do things?
mm.
And so I think that's what fascinates me so much about talking to you is just understanding, like, you obviously saw the need for something like that, and you've been trying to foster that for the better part of a decade through multiple different forums, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and like even going back to like the city days. So for example, I got to participate in one of the first mobile payments tests with it was with MasterCard, with Nokia, and obviously with Citi, and so this is like in the mid to early aughts, and 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 um and so let's say like 2006 7ish kind of time frame. And so this is way early, and so like it really was like science fiction going to the drugstore, taking out your phone and making a payment. It like the cashiers were really like, "What the heck are you doing?" and and then you were like, "Oh, this is actually really cool." And then from that point on, every year is like, "Oh, this is the year of mobile payments. This is the year of no, it's not. Okay, next year. Next year is going to be the new year of mobile payment. Oh, it's not. Oh, that following year is going to be the year of mobile payments." So it's sort of a bit of like you see the future, and then getting large scale adoption takes longer than you anticipate. But when it does, like it can accelerate quite quickly.
It's funny. I don't know, I'll probably shoot myself on the foot a little bit by saying this, but um, I'm a total Apple Pay junkie. I
Yeah,
mean, I'm sucked into Apple's ecosystem. It is what it is, man.
yeah,
I'm in now. There's no getting out. They've got me locked into the walled garden. Um, but I love being able to. We live kind of the outskirts of town, like up against like farm country. But if I head east, I go right into town, and so we love to just like walk kind of into quote unquote the little you know shopping center and things like that near us. And so I love that I can just have my Apple Watch on
yeah,
and buy a coffee or,
yeah,
grab some groceries and walk back to the house with it. And it's fascinating to me how still today every once in a while, when I tap my watch up to pay, people's minds explode.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wait, this is not like common knowledge that this is a payment mechanism in
Yeah.
2024 now. Like so I mean, to your point, like it's so true. Even in a very technology, um, you know, prevalent society as we are here in America and in major cities, like the fact that there's still gaps of understanding of what's even possible is pretty interesting and demonstrates that kind of getting wide scale adoption takes a lot of time. It takes a lot longer than people think.
It is, and it's also like, um, you know, I think the good and the bad of it is that, you know, people like you and I, we spend, you know, 24/7 thinking about, let's say digital banking or payments or fintech. But in reality, like the average person spends like a few minutes, if that.
Yeah.
And so it's not something that is top of mind. So making that change is much harder because it's like trying to, you know, changing habits is always really hard. And then convincing someone that they should change their habits is even harder.
Yeah. That really makes me think too of, I want to kind of sideline this, but I want to get your brain thinking about it. I think this is why, and I almost got this impression as we were just kind of talking before we started recording today. This is a lot of your kind of perspective too, is that I think fintech kind of coupled with the mindset of community financial institutions also has a really big positive impact that they can make to real people's lives.
Yeah.
But that there's still a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah.
Right. You know, it's really funny. So this morning, we were talking about this before. We're in that once every 4 years weird state here in Portland, Oregon, where we got some snow and some ice. Well, it turned into like straight freezing rain, and it is just an ice skating rink outside. And this morning was kind of the first time I felt like I could try and venture out and see if it was safe for my wife to go drive around and stuff. So I went to go grab us coffee at the little Dutch Brothers shop not too far from our house. It was like a mile away. We have a truck that's one of the hybrids. So it has a big battery in the back, weighs like 6 billion pounds. I have dedicated snow tires on this thing. So I'm like, I feel pretty confident that we can get out and about. I'm like, get into the line at the coffee shop. And I'm just talking to the girl as they're kind of making our coffees and things. And, you know, we got to talking about just the ice and the snow and how many people were out and weren't. And she was like, yeah, I didn't even know if I could venture out. Like, I didn't know if my car was safe. And so you have to bear with me. I'm a total car nerd. So inevitably, like, all my analogies come back to cars. But I was just talking to her about, I was like, well, actually, it has less to do with the car. It has more to do with the tires. Like, that's what's in contact with the surface. And I said jokingly, I was like, you know, I really wish they actually taught tire technology in school. Like, people need to understand that there's tires for rain, there's tires for snow, there's tires for dry. And if you have a dedicated summer tire and you're trying to get around in today's weather, you're hosed. Like, you're not going anywhere. I don't care if you have 4-wheel drive. I don't care if you have a truck. It doesn't matter. You need a tire that was designed for that type of environment. And she starts laughing. She's like, I know. I feel like there's so many things they don't teach me in school. And where I'm going with this whole story is what I thought was really, really interesting was completely unprompted. She has no idea what I do for a living, any of this. She goes, yeah, but actually, you know, the one thing I really wish that they taught us or somebody taught me was about finance and how to manage my finances. And she goes, and how to use technology for my finances to help me better understand it. And I was just like mind blown having this conversation with probably this, I don't know, 17, 18-year-old girl at this coffee shop talking about how she feels like she's been let down in understanding how to leverage all of this technology that's around her to help her better understand her finances. And she's like, I have no idea. What was funny was she goes, I do know how to write a check though. I was like, oh, yeah, that's good. But you know, I think kind of coming back to, like I said, I would like to kind of sideline that and kind of come back to just the whole topic of technology and the impact it can have for people. But, you know, I think what's interesting is that like that also goes back to what you were talking about of why you felt it was important to kind of create this ecosystem of free collaboration. to help kind of propel the industry forward to actually make positive impacts.
Absolutely, and I think, and sort of even getting back to, even sort of like the community banks, and it's sort of like a lot of times, there's sort of an assumption that, just because you work with money, like you have all the resources at your disposal, and obviously protecting and accounts, protecting data is like so important, but it's also like there's limited resources. So like like for example, with Money 2020, there was we used to put together sessions about, like, maybe with some of the bigger banks and things like that, and we'd cover things. But then as things progressed, realized that, like, actually the world is completely different for other types of banks or other types of financial institutions, and the way that they look at things is different. You might not like, just as an example, looking at like data. For example, you might have, at a large bank, you'll have thousands of people that will help massage data, analyze data. Whereas at, like, a community bank, that's not the case. That entire organization is thousands of people. So it puts different um, uh, emphases on different elements of the business. And so I think that, like, as we progress with Money 20, and just a quick side note, like at the early days of Money 20, I was in charge of picking speakers, putting together the agenda, and I coming new to the to the events industry, I was like, okay, the content is like the main thing. That's what everybody's there for. And then after like a couple of years, what I realized was that, like, and one thing I used to do is, like, used to introduce my startup friends with my banker friends and with my investor friends, and help create, and eventually they would come back to me and they'd say, "Oh, thank you for introducing me to so and so. Thank you." Like, the big bank and the fintech would both say, "Thank you so much," and there was mutual value in that. And as it progressed, I realized actually that is like the main value of an event, and that's sort of why, like, now with like Fintech Meetup, I just sort of feel like we're for me, it was like addressing a value proposition that was sort of like networking, and meetings are a big part of it, like, and
Yeah.
talked about by all events, but like just having something where you apply technology to help solve that problem, that's sort of what drew me to it, and it's sort of like, so now I'm not sure if that answers the question, or if I went off on some
No,
random.
that's perfect. And what's funny is you actually brought me to one of the things I really wanted to talk to you about is, bear with me. I don't know if you're going to love me or hate me for what I'm about to say, but,
Yeah.
I think what Fintech Meetup is really, really unique and super cool for a couple of reasons. And for my listeners, just fair warning, I am not paid for, endorsed spokesperson for this. I just really actually think it's a pretty cool idea. Um, and here's why, because I'm going to be a little bit dangerous with my statement here, but, you look at kind of the traditional conference, right? And don't get me wrong, there's absolutely a ton of value that happens in these things. But from a like vendor buyer perspective, it's kind of awkward, right? Like, we're kind of standing there at our little booth, and like, you're there for some other reason, but we paid for the event. So you feel kind of obligated to like stop by and say hi. And then, like, I got to go back to my boss and tell him how many leads I got. So I got to like really jump on you. And I'm really hoping I can give you my tchotchke. Like, I've got a cooler stress ball than he's got. And I don't know, it's just kind of weird, right? And there's absolutely some really beautiful collaboration and connections that happen in that. But there's also some awkwardness to the, like, hey, do we really want to talk? Do you really even care about my product? Are you just trying to be nice? Are you just trying to get my tchotchke for your grandkids? Like, um, and so from like the vendor and almost buyer perspective, um, it's kind of its own thing.
Yeah.
Fintech Meetup comes along, and I actually really think this was a disruption to the traditional model of that. I think it was a really big leapfrog. And this is where you're going to either love me or hate me for how I'm going to say this, but I think what's really cool about it is like, it's literally like the Tinder for speed dating of, people in the fintech industry. Hey, I do this. You do this. I want to talk about this. Do you want to talk about it? I do. We both said yes. And we set up a 15-minute speed date and we sit down and we meet. And then
Yeah,
there's no awkwardness. Like we both
yeah.
agreed, like, hey, I'm coming in. I'm like, hey, I'm Josh. I work for Typhone. I sell digital banking. Do you want to buy digital banking? And if they say no, I'm like, cool, then there's no awkwardness to this. And if they
Yeah.
say yes, then I know I've got a really solid 15-minute conversation with somebody that actually sees value in the service that I provide, and vice versa. And it's not just about selling products. It's about being able to connect with, like you said, investors and other fintechs that we can partner with to grow an ecosystem. And so it really gives you this unique opportunity to use technology to help, like you said, kind of filter through all that noise and just put together really solid meetings. So I'd love to understand some of the concept behind this and why you all felt that there was power in doing it this way.
Yeah, so before I answer that question, like, since you mentioned Tinder, then I'll have to draw the analogy to the first example of the vendors in the, in the traditional events. It's then that's a bit like a middle school dance. Right. And you're right. It is, I do think that there's, um, like, and but part of the thinking actually did come out of, the pandemic. Actually,
Mm.
when like you couldn't go to events, you couldn't meet people, and everything was virtual. And so actually the first, Fintech Meetup was virtual.
Yeah.
And it was, and so then, you sort of run into a situation where, well, we're in a digital medium. Yeah, how do we take advantage of that? Like, so for example, um, with something digital, you can have much more data used in sort of that decision process. Like if you and I were to meet in a networking room at like some traditional conference, we wouldn't know who. Yeah, we could look at the badges, but then beyond that, there's not much else. Um, Whereas if you're interacting with, if you're able to use technology to interact, like you can say, "Oh, I'm interested in a digital banking solution. I work for, a regional bank in the Midwest. If 50% of our business is like small businesses, another 50% of our business is consumer, and like there might be data there that is relevant for you to help you like figure out, okay, like what might be interesting to me, and so if you can use that data to, um, it's a bit like, going back to the Netflix Blockbuster thing. Um, the traditional, event is like walking into a Blockbuster video, and then you have to go to the action section. You have to go to the new release section. You have to go to the children's section. And that's sort of how and you are limited by what's categorically there. Whereas like Netflix, um, your viewing data can be used to help determine what is interesting to you. So like, for example, um, my wife and I on Netflix, like there was a time where we started watching we watched several like Korean Korean TV series, and then I think Netflix thought we were Korean or something like that, because then we would see a lot of Korean movies which and some we saw, and then after some point we were like, okay, let's watch some other stuff, and then so that sort of evolved. So I think there's no way you're going to walk into a Blockbuster video and say, oh, this person is interested in
Yeah.
Korean serials.
I'm glad you brought up the point too of just, this is no disrespect whatsoever to folks. We were all navigating a difficult time, but it was really interesting to watch what happened to kind of the traditional conferences in the pandemic, right? And I think what a lot of folks did was say, this is what we did in the physical world, put in the digital world.
Yeah.
Right. And then that whole like vendor booth thing got even more awkward, because then you are like, okay, so you're going to have a digital booth and people are going to stop by your digital booth, and like nobody stopped by your digital booth. You're crazy to think that. Like, at least I could, bribe them with a cookie to come by my booth in the real world, but I can't even do that in the, digital world. And so it really did take thinking about that very, very differently
Yeah.
to be able to create an environment where collaboration could happen digitally. Because I think that's also why I'm glad you brought that up, is I think that is also just such a great example that can be applied to other areas, right?
Yeah.
Like just trying to take something the way we've always done it and pivot it and do the same thing we've always done, but in a different place or different way, it doesn't always work.
No.
And sometimes you have to think very, very differently. And that's, to your point from earlier, like that's where real disruption happens. That's where not just turning the credit card 90 degrees happens.
Yeah, I absolutely. Yeah, and a lot of times it's very unexpected. Like, so going back even to like Intel, I helped launch Intel's graphics chip business back in the 90s. And our first product was a 2D, 3D graphics accelerator. And so there was the 3D piece. We were basically taking military simulator technology, like multi-million-dollar military simulator technology, putting it on a $25 chip. And then there's also a piece that involved 2D that would control your display. You could play DVDs and things like that on it. And the funny thing was that you were 2D, 3D back then, like even though we put a lot of resources into the 3D, like we sort of assumed that 2D, like watching videos and movies, would be like the main usage of it, much more so than the 3D. But today, like the gaming industry is bigger than Hollywood, and it's sort of like how things that you wound up you're thinking you're creating something in one world, but it's in the world completely changes into a different way, so like even like the back during the pandemic, like there was all these like virtual worlds, even going back to like like The Sims and things like that. It's sort of like I still feel like we're nowhere near where that's mainstream yet. I do think it's a bit off, and so I think that like at least from my perspective, like when you meet someone in person, it's such a very different experience from meeting them virtually, and I don't. I'm sure there's some biological elements to it, but like it's like when you have that face to face, it's a very different type of a bond, and maybe trust and understanding that you build. And to assume that you could transpose one with the other is, yeah, I mean, as you pointed out, it's like it's a fallacy.
Isn't that? I never thought we were going to go down this path, but isn't that so true? Yeah, I'm sure there's somebody way smarter than me that's got some data and some understanding on why, but there absolutely is. I mean, it's really interesting. I have, people that I've never met. We were talking about some of the folks on like our India team, right?
Mm.
That I've never had the opportunity to meet, but I mean, they're like family to me because we've developed this bond over years. But there's still something that's just missing. There's a part of my soul that literally yearns to give them a hug.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's just, you can't do that in the virtual world. So I think there are, certain things that are just completely irreplaceable, but can be augmented with technology.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think, so when you do meet your coworkers in India, like you will have that knowledge of them, so that when you do meet them in person, even though, like if you met them like for the first time, versus meeting them now, that if you only had 15 minutes, you could make so much more impact with that 15 minutes.
Yeah.
So I think it's like to take your example, if you met them, you would augment what you've done so much more, but also because you've had that digital experience, you will know them much better than if you just met them physically as well too.
Yeah. Yeah, we're really detouring this sucker, and I'm all for it. Um, I think that was one of the other things that I found really, really fascinating about the pandemic. And I don't know why, like literally just you and I getting ready for this podcast had me really thinking about it beforehand. Is you've got all this really cool stuff on the wall behind you, and
Yeah,
I've actually been really thoughtful about like how we put my office together for this podcast. And
yeah,
like, it's important to me that it's not completely stale and it has some of the personality of it. And I think a lot of that is because what I witnessed in the pandemic was the more we got on these like virtual meetings and
yeah,
people took them from their homes, I felt like I created a new level of depth that I also could not have gotten in person.
yeah,
Because a lot of these times, like, I mean, we'd have to get to a very specific level before you're going to bring me into your home,
yeah,
right? But now I get to be in your home. And, I know it's silly, but I used to love when, we first kind of got into the pandemic of everybody having to go remote
yeah,
and a lot of people that hadn't experienced working from home before. And you'd see people were like so ashamed when their dog would bark or their
yeah,
kid would
yeah,
come running through. And I was like, no, this is great. Like, we're
yeah,
humans. It's okay. It's really cool to actually see you in that element. Like, that's awesome. No, now tell me about your dog. No, hey, what grade is your kid in? Like, what are they studying or what's going on in their world? And you got to know people in a very different light. So I think it's really cool, like you were saying, to be able to almost have the opportunity in this day and age to blend those two things, right?
yeah,
Like you and I are getting an opportunity to do this podcast virtually where we're both getting to see into each other's homes, our lives, connect, and we're getting to build a relationship and a bond through this that, to your point, like the first time I actually get to meet you in person is going to be
yeah,
totally different. Like instead
absolutely.
of being like, hi, nice to meet you. I'm like, hey man, give me a hug. You've been a guest on the podcast. This is awesome. I don't know. It's cool.
That's such a great point. Like, how often do you meet someone where your first physical interaction is a hug?
Yeah.
Without digital, that never happened. Like, who's crazy enough to like go into an office and like start hugging random people like the first time you meet? But now that we know each other virtual, like, at least through this medium, you're right. Like when we see each other in person, our first interaction will be a hug.
Yeah. So since we're taking this thing, like deep into left field, let's just keep trucking.
You know,
So now I'm gonna throw a crazy curve. So what do you think about like, Zuckerberg's push into the metaverse, and what are your thoughts on this? Like, what do you think it's going to take for that to become mainstream, or do you think it ever will? And what do you think the impacts of that are going to be?
yeah, that's like yeah, that's a whole lot of other hours of topic.
You did say earlier, like, don't get you started on AI because you were into it before it was even a thing. So now
Yeah,
I've opened up that can of worms.
yeah. That's so. I think that um, on one hand, it's sort of like if the human mind is very good at picking out when they're being tricked. I think like in many respects, it's like so if you're trying to recreate the world as and make a virtual world, like you'll pick that up right now. I think whereas if you are trying to present yourself in a maybe like suspended version of reality, if you suspend reality, you're like so so that's why like Minecraft or Roblox or they're real but not real, and you know that they're not real, and I think that if you're in something where in a virtual world where um you're sort of forced to be suspend your disbelief, um I think that is that has a greater set likelihood of being adopted. I'd say. Whereas if you're trying to create something that is like, oh, this is a world, this is the end all be all world where everything happens, and it's I think I I don't know. I think that well, I think that raises more ethical questions, but it
Yeah.
also um it also, I think it's going to trip the rails of being suspension of disbelief, in our minds as well too. So I, I think that, the way I sort of view it is that, you know, having virtual realities for targeted types of purposes, like I could sort of see that happening, but like sort of just a general multi-purpose, virtual world is probably much harder to do. And it's like, even like thinking about like, so I left Citibank to work on an ed tech company where we were trying to build educational, socially networked education apps. So we had so we did the first official Khan Academy mobile app. We did apps for MIT, for Cornell, and the funny thing was that, like, so for example, the MIT, there was like lectures, you watching videos of lectures, whereas with the Khan Academy, it's more like you're seeing graphics and you're seeing stuff that was like much more simplified, and the engagement on and no surprise now, like the engagement on the Khan Academy stuff was so much more because it was like designed for that interface, and it wasn't trying to recreate like a classroom. It was trying to, like, just focus in on something to transfer that idea to the listener, to the reader, or to the watcher. Um, and so, like, I think if you try to do too much, it's going to be, I don't know. I think the risk of failure is much harder.
Yeah, that's actually, I don't know if I've really thought about it that way, but that makes a lot of sense when I apply that to kind of the meta example.
Mm,
Is it just feels so expansive, which I think is part of the intent, right?
mm,
But I think it's also why it is less appealing. I don't know. When you were talking about like very intent based specific use cases of, augmented or virtual reality or suspended reality, like that seems to have some real legs to it.
mhm,
If you ask me, I know that I actually haven't seen it, and people fault me for it because it's probably something I would absolutely love. But I guess there was even like a Netflix documentary on, taking a bunch of kids who were, doing racing simulators
mm,
and then put them in real race cars,
yeah,
and they beat real race car drivers. And it was because they had the ability, like, because the technology had gotten so good, it was so close to the real thing. And they
yeah,
were so good at actually mapping out the tracks to the nth degree.
yeah,
And, the race car driver, he goes around a couple of times. He's got to get new tires. He's got to get fuel. Car breaks down. He gets tired. It gets dark. These kids can race on the simulator 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. They've gone around that track far more times than the race car driver has.
yeah,
And you start thinking about applying that to, like, a surgeon, and how many times are they able to do open heart surgery, right? And
yeah,
being able to actually do that in, say, an augmented reality versus actually having to do that in the real, does that give them, or pilots? And
mm,
so, I mean, I think there's some really cool use cases to it, but I am really curious to see what happens with the mainstreamness of it.
mm. That's a great question, I it's I don't know if you're familiar, but like the first video on demand test happened in Orlando, Florida. I think it was AT&T that did it.
Hmm.
I think it was a couple, but basically they it was in Orlando, and they literally had like people going around on roller skates, like with VHS tapes, like putting them into various machines that fed into it was very physical and very
Huh.
like and that was the technology at the time. And I think that I mean, this better than anyone, like infrastructure matters. And I think so right now we're probably from a meta universe perspective, there's limitations of infrastructure also like, if only like, let's say 1% of people have like these goggle things, that sort of limits what you can do with it. And there's definitely elements of like economies of scale and scope here.
Yeah.
And so I think it's and not that I'm necessarily advocating that we should all jump to having these things on our head. No, I but it's sort of like I think there too. It's going to be like um you mentioned you loved automobiles, right? So like I actually back in 1990 I helped design build an electric car.
Oh,
Back
cool.
yeah, it was back when I was in college, and it was a GM sponsored project, and it was like
Hmm.
and it was like really I had a lot of fun doing it. But like if you think about cars, like I sort of feel like that might be a place where we might start seeing some of this meta technology first, because you have the screen, you have you can put heavier equipment and sensors and things like that without it feeling like burdensome. Like you're naturally in a vehicle that has these glass panels all around you, so your reality is all around you, but through the glass. And you have that there's so many sensors and computers on these cars now. So like I actually, I'm totally spitballing here, but I actually think that like cars would probably be a place where we're going to start seeing some of this stuff first, or probably a natural place to try some of this stuff.
Oh, interesting. What do you think some of the use cases would be for something like that?
I mean, there's definitely stuff like um uh like on the screen, like if you're talking about, oh, are you hungry? And I'm like, yeah, I'm hungry too. I could go for some pizza. And then like you could you could start seeing some types of ideas popping up, or like some restaurants being highlighted, or even like um you th- like thinking about even your schedule, right? Like we have our calendars, um and then if we have certain locations on our calendars, like you could say like, hey, I I need to get to this meeting, but I need a cup of coffee. And then like, so you could look at the calendar, you could look at the location, you could look at the traffic, and sort of tr- uh, you know triangulate, like, okay, if you really want a cup of coffee, you can get crappy cup of coffee here. But if you're looking for like, the pour over, this might be a place, and you have the time to do that. So it's yeah, I don't know, like
Yeah.
it's probably stuff that, like, it might stuff that seems a bit and pedestrian right now, and I'm sure like smarter people are going to come up with all kinds of other great ideas than I just.
No, yeah, no, that really got me thinking. I mean, but it's cool because I feel like you're already starting to see the groundworks of some of that
Mhm.
infrastructure and like habit creation being formed.
You know,
Like going back to what we were talking about earlier,
you know,
like apparently my phone and my car think that I'm a coffee junkie, which is absolutely true. Um, and literally, when I got in the truck this morning, it was like, it's 4 minutes to Dutch. I'm like, yeah,
you
thanks.
know,
That is where I'm going. Yes, you know that. You know, so yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. Um, what do you think the impacts of just the evolution of computing power and things like quantum computing? What are the impacts that those are going to have on the ability to actually leverage that kind of technology as well?
yeah, I'm like, in general, like computing power is um it's so I actually got to meet Gordon Moore. I got to meet
Oh,
Andy
really?
Grove. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Oh,
Like I
super cool.
yeah, yeah. So I
That's a whole nother
actually
podcast in itself,
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
sure.
I saw Steve Jobs pitch the next computer, but when I was in high school. It was I've seen like a
Oh,
lot of
wow.
these like
That's so neat.
it was just really cool stuff, and it's like um this is all like, when they're talking, it it it's very much a case where, like, the future, as improbable as it is, seems very, very real. You know, and so like even with something like quantum computing right now, there's obviously like it's still in it's quite early days, I'd say, but like now we're starting to see like things that are more stable, things that are more reproducible, um, and um, and to be honest, like it's sort of if you can do like a like a the so one of the things with quantum computing is that you're able to parallelize a lot of stuff and do a lot of operations much faster, so that i- much faster than traditional digital technology. And so if you're able to do things much more massively faster in parallel, you know what that opens up the opportunities for uh doing new types of analytics, new types of um even like just like screen creation if you want, or scenario playing out different scenarios and predictions. Obviously the cryptography thing is huge, and probably like what's on a lot of people's mind right now. If cryptography can be hacked with quantum computers, so I think there's always like a bit of like almost like magic that opens up when you are able to make something much more parallelized, um, and do things quicker. I I don't know. I'm not sure if I'm
No, oh
talking
my gosh, you
gobbledygook
really
or
got my brain going. But before we go on, I'm going to put you on the spot if you're cool with it, and
yeah,
I hope this is okay. Um, but I don't know if anybody listening caught what you talked about in beating John Moore, but do you can you articulate Moore's law a little bit? Because I think that's actually really important to the conversation that we're having.
yeah,
And I only know it well enough by
yeah,
osmosis through Siva, our
yeah,
CEO, who's a former
yeah.
Inteller and talks about it all the time. But I think it'd be really valuable to kind of maybe talk through that a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. So basically, like Moore's law, like semiconductor technology, like the way that you make these chips is with basically like how you do photography. Like you use you basically you use lights, and um you print these chips basically with various digital, what with transistors. And and the engineering in me is like saying like you're massively oversimplifying it. That's not what it is.
Well, my brain operates on massive oversimplification, so we're good there.
Yeah. And so basically like say if you have let's just say a 1 inch by 1 inch a piece of silicon. Moore's law says that you could increase that density, you could double that density like once every 18 months. And then so like after 18 months, what used to be 1 inch by 1 inch, you could fit one chip, but by doubling the density, you could get two chips, let's say, in there. And then that's going to be at half the cost. So and also there's power implications as well too. So like and so ba- basically like Moore's law talks about how you can increase the density, decrease the power, and also increase the speed as well too, all at half the cost. So the and like I said, the engineer in me is like, uh, you know, yelling at me like, "What are you saying?" But let's just leave it at that. As at least
Well,
as like a
and I think a good real world example for those of us like myself is, you think about um, if you apply some significant time to this
mm,
principle,
you
right?
know,
There's more compute power in my
yeah,
Apple Watch than there was on the lunar lander,
mm,
right? And conversely, just thinking about it at a short term scale, like how many of you have gone to Costco and looked at the price of TVs over the
yeah,
last couple of years,
yeah,
right? And I remember it wasn't that long ago, like a 55-inch TV was like a big deal, and it could be like 10 grand.
Yeah.
And, we were literally just looking at new TVs for our trade show booth for conferences. And man, you can get a 120-inch TV for 2 grand.
Mhm. Yeah.
Right. So I think that's just like, if you're trying to apply it to like, what does that mean for real world? Like, that's showing just how fast this technology is evolving, and it's at an exponential scale. Right.
Yes. Yeah. 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 I think
Um,
so.
so you also said something that was really, really fascinating to me about, kind of the concern of things like quantum computing being able to hack cryptography.
Mm.
And it gave me the opportunity to come back to something I've been dying to talk to you about, because you mentioned it when we were like, just talking before recording. And it has really stuck with me because I love the way that you said it. And you said, you know, things are always kind of getting better, but then everything up levels.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's a great example of what you were talking about, right? Where
Yeah.
it's like, yes, we're getting better. Like, we're getting better security. And if we start talking about, you know, banking and payments, yeah, security is kind of an important thing, and fraud mitigation tools. And so we're up leveling those things, but at the same time, everything else is up leveling. Right.
Yeah.
And so what are the implications when all of a sudden, this, supercomputer, quantum computer, it doesn't matter. You could have a 4 billion character password. It'll still hack that sucker in 4 seconds. Like, then what's the point? Then I might as well just
Yeah.
like keep cash and like leave it on my front porch. And if somebody takes it, they take it. I don't know. So I don't know. I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. It, um, I, I always sort of, sometimes it's hard for me to think too far ahead. Right. And like s- what I'll say is like, in general, I do tend to think like, I try to put myself in situations where I'm living in the future. Like, so for example, like I said, back in 1990, I was helping design an electric car. Um, my my master's project back in 95 was about basically what was smartphones, what wound up becoming smartphones. Um, I worked on I got published in artificial intelligence research back in 93. So like, it's sort of like, if you can get a taste of the future ahead of everyone else, like that sort of maybe gives you a bit of a leg up. And another really crazy example was, I met this, before smartphones, I met this entrepreneur who was trying to create like a location-based service. Um, and so he used to walk around with a laptop and a cell antenna, like hooked up to his laptop, and that's how he would walk around, because like he was like, at some point we're gonna have powerful computing attached to location, and you're gonna be able to walk around with it. And I was like, that you look like an absolute crazy person.
And now,
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, and so to the extent that like I'm able to like experience a little bit of the future, even if it might be painful, that like, so like, to take it make that example a little bit like easier, like, or not as crazy, like I started using a Chromebook as my main computer. Like, I've been doing that for like 6 years or so. And back 6 years ago, it was really painful, like not having a laptop that had apps on it, but built in, needing connectivity all the time. But I was like, I just sort of felt like, okay, we're gonna get to a point where everything's gonna be cloud based, everything's gonna be like at a distance. It's not gonna be apps on your laptop. And so it was painful initially, but now I'm like, okay, well, this is sort of how everybody does stuff now.
it's so funny. It's just so funny, the parallels between you and Siva. Siva's been on that Chromebook train for like 6, 7 years. Uh, and in his like original one, he still uses to this day, and it's finally starting to die on him. And it's just hilarious. And I don't know, man, sorry, like a little detour. this is what's so cool about this podcast is, man, there are just some really fascinating humans in this world. And just listening to you talk, like you are absolutely in one of those categories for me where I sit back and I'm probably going to end this podcast and wonder, what am I doing with my life? But but so kind of going back to this, this idea of, everything is kind of constantly up leveling. And sometimes like we feel like we're getting better, like we're getting an
Yeah.
idea. We've done some really positive disruption, but then everything up levels around that. Like, what do you think the implications of that are for kind of traditional finance and banking? And then, kind of coming full circle back to, why do you think it's then so important for the collaboration to happen within the fintech ecosystem to be able to constantly, evolve and up level alongside that?
Yeah, I think part of like one big point is like understanding your end consumer's needs, and if you use that as like a bit of the springboard for everything else, I think that will be helpful for however things evolve. Um, so like if like even going back to like that credit card example initially, if you think of, my goal in life is credit cards versus my goal in life is to help people access payments or money when they don't have it physically with them. Two very different things. You could take it two many different ways, and obviously, like you don't want to make it like too big because then you're going to be trying to boil the ocean. But if you are able to tie it back to some kind of a core need, customer need, then that at least enables you to like stay in reality and then think about um yeah, and then figure out, okay, what technology makes sense to use. Um, and what technology might, and then you also have to think about like what technology is going to be able to evolve as the customer needs evolve or as the use cases evolve. So that up leveling is you know a lot of most companies don't necessarily do that very well. Like there's a disruptor that comes in, and then you're sort of forced to like follow and try to see if you can save as much of your business as you can. But if you and also to this point, like a lot of times, like there are some customers that are like that their needs are like so advanced that like they might be sort of lead thought leaders as far as like where the market's going to go or how the market might move, and so that it's sort of like having a diverse, thinking about customer needs from a diversity
Mm.
of 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 customers, that's also very helpful.
Yeah. Um, no, that makes a lot of sense when you look at just the power of these types of events and why, like we've been talking about, right? I mean, we can do a lot of this virtually, but why there's a lot of power in actually getting to sit down with people. And again, I mean, I've said this far too many times on this podcast, but it's also why I love this podcast. It's just,
Yeah.
I think diversity of thought is probably one of the most powerful things that we have,
Mm.
right? If you're trying to go at it alone, like,
Yeah.
best luck to you.
Yeah.
Um, seriously. And I think, especially when we come back to kind of the noble efforts of this industry, right? I
Mm.
mean, the impacts that we can have on real people's lives, and the freedom that, financial health and stability and security provide is
Yeah.
truly life changing.
Yeah.
So if we can look at how can we collaborate to leverage, existing plus technology and kind of this heart element of it all, there's a ton of opportunity. And even just,
Mm.
my example of the of the girl at Touch Bros this morning, right? Like,
Mm.
there's still a really big need to be
Mm.
able to solve for some of these gaps in getting people to that place where they feel comfortable and confident and successful in their financial health and stability and well-being. Um, and so I think there's a lot of opportunity still out there. So it's really cool to see, folks like yourself and organizations like Fintech Meetup and, the conference circuit as a whole, just just putting people in a place to collaborate and taking down those barriers of disruption and innovation and allowing people to think outside the box. But you also made a really good point that I don't want to gloss over, which is I think what makes entrepreneurs like yourself so fascinating to me, it's just not my DNA. And it's really, to your point, like if you're too far out there, it's just not going to stick.
Mm.
But if you're too close, it doesn't actually do any disruption.
Yeah.
And there's this magical space in between. And it's
Absolutely.
really hard to hit that magical space in between.
Yeah, it is. And it's sort of, I think like, I, who was it? It might have been Bill Gross or someone like that. He did an analysis of like startups that failed and what and the reason that they failed. And timing was like, I think the top factor, or
Oh,
yeah,
makes sense.
and it's sort of even if you even thinking about like just investing, like stock investing, like if you're trying to do a timing strategy, you're never you're gonna lose. It's really hard to get, and this is like an equities market. So timing is really hard. It's sort of like you. I think part of it, and this is also sort of why like so many entrepreneurs talk about pivots, is a bit like you have a certain idea of how you feel the world is going to move, and you build something for that, but then it might not happen for the mass market, but it might happen for let's say the small business segment, or might happen for cross border, or might happen for large enterprise. So it's sort of like there's having being able to look at the world in a diverse manner also helps you figure out like what might be a natural home for what you have at the moment as well.
Yeah. Okay. I have to ask a question then. I'm really curious to get your unbridled take on. So what do you think what do you think of Fed now?
Oh wow. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm like coming way out of left field on that.
Yeah, yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, yeah. No, I love it. I mean, I think it's sort of like just to date myself, like back in when we sold TX via to Google, I was I was trying to come up with product requirements for like bank account access. So I was looking at it initially in the US, but then also looking at it internationally too. Like, so for example, the UK. And I was like, just so uh, I had only worked in financial services in the US. So I just sort of thought that that's the way everything worked. But then when I looked at UK, I'm like, oh, wow, you can actually do things faster and do things. And I'm like, wow. And so it's definitely like a case where now I'm seeing like, oh wow, it's great to see that real time element of it come to the States. But also it's I having spoken to a lot of financial institutions, there's obviously like faster payments also means faster risk, faster fraud, and so balancing that is it's really hard, as you know.
Yeah.
So I think it's gonna be like, like a lot of things, it's gonna be happen in like or be available for limited use cases, and then it'll expand with more data. Um, but also like, just to take it back to like when I first joined Citibank, in 2001, the big question was, will consumers ever be comfortable putting their credit credit card
Yeah.
information online? And that's not a question now.
No, yeah,
Uh,
yeah. Is everything.
um, but like the questions in the initial days are very different from but it takes a lot of
That's really
work.
valuable insight.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that also is a good example of what we were talking about earlier of if you just carbon copy what we did to what we're gonna do,
Yeah.
then yeah, a lot of times like you're gonna face some of the same challenges. And I think that's been something that just personally, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to really talk to you about it, being a self-prescribed technology and payments geek.
Yeah.
Is when that's one of the things we hear all the time, right? Is like faster payments equals faster fraud.
Yeah.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
If you do things the way you did them.
Yeah.
But if you do things differently,
Yeah.
we're actually seeing a significantly lower amount of fraud in
Yeah.
Fed
Yeah.
now.
Yeah. Yes.
But yes, if you apply
That's a great point.
historical logic
That's a
and you
great.
don't say our technology is up leveling, how can
Yeah.
we up level with it?
Yeah.
Yeah, faster payments equals faster fraud without better tech. But with
Yes.
better tech, it's actually better. But those are really hard, like to your point of getting things to be actually mainstream.
Mm.
And that's really hard for legacy industry to wrap around sometimes is,
Yeah.
well, no, I mean, if we just make the payment faster, then the bad guys will get the money faster.
Yeah.
Yes, but without the right safeguards.
Mm.
With the right safeguards changes everything. And I think
Yeah.
that's just a lot of what we've been talking about. I think that just felt like a really real example of if we think about things differently and continue to evolve the technology instead of just turning the credit card 90 degrees.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was just such a good example from earlier. I like using it. Then, yeah, I mean, what is it? Einstein, you keep trying the same thing over and over, expecting a different result is stupid.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, do something different. I don't know.
Yes.
But what do you think are going to be like looking in, you seem to have a pretty good track record with the crystal ball. So
Yeah.
what do you think the impacts of kind of radically changing the way the payments ecosystem in the US works? Like, what do you think the implications of that are going to be? And like you said, it's going to start with really small use cases, but what do you see are some of the potential opportunities or challenges that are going to come along with this change?
Sorry, I think there was a network glitch for a bit, so I didn't hear the question. Would you
Oh,
mind?
no worries. Yeah, I was just saying. So, with kind of that transition to a new, faster payment method, what do you think are going to be you looking at the short-term kind of use cases, but applying, your pretty successful crystal ball to
Yeah.
look at what maybe some of the later use cases are going to be? What do you think some of the disruption that's going to happen based on that is going to be?
Yeah. I think look, like even I think that I'm particularly interested or curious about business models and like so for example like like how for example like smartphones and stuff like that, like so much of it is subscription based, whereas before it might have been more like download based or product based, um and and then that's sort of on the end user side. But I think on the back end side, like how you create things, right, has traditionally been like corporation based, and then you're going to have that disaggregated as well too, and like so I don't mean to go off on a completely weird tangent, but like rather than having to have a corporation to, let's say, design a chip, like say if you could design a chip and then like get various elements of the design from these different engineers and combine them, and they're all their independent entities, and so they work together. It's like then you have like different ways of payments, different ways of it's a bit of like thinking about even like the creator economy and extending that even further, thinking about like Patreon and like how you have these new business models for creating content, um and so like I think like like even like how the music industry is now very different. I sort of I think that the business models for a lot of things are going to really change, and I'm hopefully I don't sound too crazy saying that, but
No, I think but that's what I'm really curious about, right? Like is um, you know, so actually it's funny, the very last episode I recorded is the first time I've ever let somebody from my own organization be on, and I had Siva on,
yeah,
and we just talked about kind of like what we saw in 2023, some predictions for 24. And obviously, Fed Now was one of the big topics of this last year. So we were talking a little bit about that. And, one of the things Siva talks about is that if you look at kind of the money movement in the US as a quadrant, where, your vertical axis is cost and your horizontal axis is speed, and you give it 4 buckets. We've had the 3 worst buckets, right? And the one we were missing was fast and cheap. And so we finally have that. And that's going to have really significant impacts, to your point, on like how business is actually able to operate in the US because of how currency will be able to flow.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, we're talking impacts to GDP could be realized in kind of late state of this type of evolution of money movement in the US.
Yeah.
So no, I don't think you're off base. I'm like, no, keep going. I want to hear the crazy, conspiracy theory hypothesis. Because who knows, like we were talking about earlier, like sometimes we start with one thing in mind and what it actually ends up becoming is something totally different.
Mhm.
And it's, the people that are thinking about it, the innovators, that, like you said, are kind of ahead of that and seeing what the technology is and being able to pivot.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I mean, just any other predictions on what you think, being able to kind of change the payments landscape is going to have for the US?
Yeah. I mean, I think, so it will, I think it's going to, and I do think that we're going to need, I guess, personal bots to control some of our payments. I think, and control our money much more so than we do now. Right now, it's sort of like we're able to look online and see our credit card, look at, a transaction happens when I do this or that. It's whereas like if you've lowered the cost of doing a payment, you could do it much more frequently,
Yeah.
and in lower volume, and meaning that it's a bit of like earned wage access, right? Like you could get your money as you earn it, but then take that to the other side as well too, like in terms of payments and things like that. So it's and which is cool, but it also means that you're getting data much more frequently. You're probably getting it more data from more sources, so that could potentially be very overwhelming.
Yeah. That's
And so that's why I think that we're going to need bots, different types of personal bots to control our money than versus like having it all, and they might roll up,
Hmm.
but
Yeah.
that is that enough of a aluminum foil hat thing?
No, I don't. That's actually a really cool perspective, Sanjeev. Like seriously, because that's actually one that I've been really, that's a use case I've been really keen on personally.
Yeah,
Right? You think about, I think that one of the most recent data points I have is something like 60% of US consumers still live paycheck to paycheck.
yeah,
Right? And so if you're living paycheck to paycheck and you get paid on the 15th, but your electric bill is due on the 14th, you have a
yeah,
problem.
yeah,
And so if we get to a point where we can do earned wage access
yeah,
and you can be paid at the end of the day or the end of the job
yeah,
or, whatever it may be, yes, that frequency increases. And if you also speed up the payment on the other side,
yeah,
right, it means I can make my electric payment at 11:59 and 58 seconds
yeah,
that night before it's late tomorrow and
yeah,
still be on time payment.
yeah,
And I have waited for all of my earned wage access to meet that point. But to
yeah,
your point, I never really thought about the complexity that that'll create for, quite frankly, a simple lay person, right?
yeah,
Like somebody that's an overwhelming amount of data. And like all of a sudden, like, oh my gosh, I get paid every 7 minutes. Like, so how do I budget for, well, I have $9 now and I'll have $11 in 6 more minutes and then I'll have $13 in 6 more minutes. And then like, so when can I pay my freaking electric bill? um, and I think that's a super, super astute point to talk about. Like, that's where I think some of these AI, recommendation kind of bots
yeah,
can really have an impact. So it's like, we're taking some of that complexity out of it. So we just say, hey, Sanjib, like your employer is now paying you earned wage access every day at the end of the day. We
Yeah.
see that these are your bills. So we're going to recommend and we're going to make the payment for this on this date and this
Yeah.
date. And really simplifying that process. I think that that to me is kind of like the holy grail of this whole thing,
Mm.
right?
Hmm.
Is getting to a point where we're really simplifying people's financial lives to improve their financial health and futures. Like
Yeah.
if we can accomplish that, that's I think what we're trying to get with all of this, right? I don't
Mm. No, it's it's funny. I was on uh, a prep call earlier today for Fintech Meetup, and it was about financial health, and one of the speakers was talking about like how there's sort of a myth that like if you tell people enough that they will do it, but but that's not the case. It's not the case. And everybody laughed and we're like, yeah, we could relate to that.
yeah.
And you don't think about it, but it's like for financial services, it's sort of like, you tell people, "Oh, you should save this, you should save this, you repeat it, or, you should invest. It's not going to make it, that there's, repetition isn't the solution to the problem.
No, that's a good point. Um, Sanjeev, I feel like I could literally talk to you for days. I can't even begin to tell you how much I've really enjoyed this conversation with you. And I really look forward to people being able to collaborate because of people like you, putting the thought behind really creating and cultivating experiences around collaboration, and specifically in our industry. So I would literally want to tip my hat to you and your team of folks there at Fintech Meetup and what you've done just in the past for facilitating this. So thank you for what you've done.
With that, thank you very much, Josh, and it was a privilege to be here, and I really enjoyed this conversation with you.
Well, before I let you go, I have two final questions for you. So if
Yeah.
people want to connect with you or
Yeah.
learn more about you, and if they want to learn more about Fintech Meetup, how can they do that?
Yeah, so I'm quite active on LinkedIn. My first name is Sanjib, last name is Kalita. So I'm on LinkedIn/in/ for Sanjib Kalita. So that's how they can get in touch with me there. And for Fintech Meetup, it's my email address is sanjib at fintech fintech meetup meetup.com. And go to the website, learn more about the event, and hopefully, we'll see many of your listeners there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just hoping for a discount out of this now, but seriously, I can't recommend the event enough. It's a really phenomenal event if you want to just get down to brass tacks, and just connect with people and talk about the things that are interesting. It's such a cool forum for that. So kudos to the thought process there.
Thank you.
Last but not least, just out of curiosity, where do you go to stay up to date on what's happening in our industry? What other kind of shout outs can you give for places you like to go to get information?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned to you, like, I love business and technology. So like when I was a technologist, I used to love reading business stuff. And now that I'm in business, I love reading technology stuff. So I always sort of feel like I need to augment it. Like, so like on the technology side of things, like I really enjoy Wired and just like sort of their future view on things and stuff and then like even like stuff like the MIT Technology Review and those types of things like some of the more academic stuff I think is too deep for me, so I don't even try. So and then, like, as far as,
That's terrifying if something's too deep for you. I'm just going to stay way the heck away from it then.
on the, I actually, from within our industry, like, I do follow, like, I actually LinkedIn is what I sort of live and breathe a lot of knowledge from there and, like, try to click on and, it's sort of like, and obviously going to events and meeting people, that's obviously a huge thing for me as well too.
Love it. Well, again, Sanjeev, thank you so much for this time. It has been an absolute pleasure just getting to know you, hear a little bit of your story, and your insight has been just absolutely fascinating. Like, I can't get over it. So thank you so much for coming and being a guest on the Digital Banking Podcast.
Thank you, Josh. It was my pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Digital Banking Podcast powered by Typho. Find more episodes on digitalbankingpodcast.com or subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your favorite podcasts.